all right. Welcome to another episode of the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast. This is episode number 31, and it was with Miss Shayla Dube.
Yeah, and Miss Shayla, she is a clinical social worker, clinical supervisor, consultant, and an educator in Canada. And a lot of her life and her practice is guided by the African philosophy that she grew up with of Ubuntu. I am because we are, so we talk a lot about that. And she also has a big focus on communal healing, collective liberation. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode.
Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful conversation. We didn't know Shayla personally coming into this conversation, but I only have good things and good feelings about it. And the whole Ubuntu, I am because we are, the whole idea of liberation and social work, it's just exactly what revolutionary social work is all about and how they intersect. And so I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did recording it.
Yeah, peace.
Hey, listen, we got some things that we gotta discuss, how we can affect the system and make it better for us. But first, we gotta start with the man in the mirror. Open your third eye and the vision's gonna be much clearer. We are revolutionary. We are visionary. And we stand resolute on those who pollute the minds of many. Revolutionary. We are visionary. And we stand resolute on those who pollute the minds of many, y'all. This is the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast, y'all.
Good morning, everybody, or maybe good afternoon for some people. And welcome to another episode of the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Alicia.
Ace?
And we are lucky to be here with Shayla Dube. Can you just remind me how I say your name? Because I feel like I said it wrong, and introduce yourself.
You're saying it pretty perfect. It's Dube, and Dube in the language of Isindebele in Zimbabwe means zebra. So it happens to be my maternal last name. It's my mother's last name, but I was raised from the maternal side of my family. So that's the last name that I've always used from birth. And you asked me to introduce myself and left it as a blank slate. So the name, I think in your introduction when you were marketing this event, you did write my given name and the name that I use now. Perhaps it's probably the right time to share a little bit of that about that as a part of my introduction. So I was named Smangele, which is also in Isindebele, and it means we are surprised. I like to tell the story that it was not a pleasant surprise because my mother was a teenager and she was one of the brightest of the 6 children that my grandparents had. So they had better hopes and expectations for her. I'm sure they wanted her to be a doctor or a nurse or a teacher like most parents. But instead of bringing the distinctions that she usually brought, she brought me instead. So I was named Smangele, and that meant we are surprised. Although, of course, I think we often say children are a blessing and what have you, but if we have to be honest with each other, no parent is happy when their 18-year-old comes home pregnant. So I've always carried that meaning that it wasn't a pleasant surprise. So I, as an inquisitive child who was raised by my grandparents, I asked them why they gave me that name and why didn't they write it in their diaries. So my grandmother said to me, well, it's not a priority for us, but when you're older and you have your own money, feel free to change the name. So I held on to that, and I moved to Canada when I was 20 years old, just about to turn 21. So I made sure that when I got my money, I would change it. So, but a little bit of info, I think what expedited the process of changing my name wasn't just the not liking the surprise part of Smangele, but it was because after distributing my resumes and all of that, I wasn't getting the job interviews. But as soon as I shortened it to SIMA, just the SIMA, I saw like a quick change, a quick transformation in the calling of me for interviews. So I changed it because I realized that it wasn't getting me where I wanted. So it ended up obviously being Shayla. I wanted to keep up the initials of S, but I had to think about meaning. I just happened to be a person who critically thinks about things. So the name Shayla is apparently Hebrew. It's a combination of Shay and Layla, but it means question. So I was that kid that questioned everything. So I became an inquisitive, and Sima, which is now the shortcut of my given name, means treasure. So I went from being a surprise to being a treasure who questions everything. So I think from an introduction perspective, perhaps I am that person who likes to question a lot of things. And I am a mother, I'm a wife. And that's just, I'm trying to stick to who I am instead of what I do, because I think most of us are so quick to say, I'm Shayla, I have a bachelor's degrees, master's, and whatever. And then we struggle to talk about who we are. So to keep it short, I'll leave it at that. And if you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I love that. I did something like this with some of my supervisees recently where I had them I didn't give them kind of background information, but I just said, describe yourself. And so many of it was what I am and what I do. And so then in all of the big list of things that came, we circled the ones that are really who are we, and then circled the ones that are what. And it was just really interesting to see how many labels we tag ourselves with that are just what, and then we lose that authenticity of who we are.
Right.
I think you're a lot better at this when you describe yourself and think about yourself. You do tend to go more to who you are.
Yeah, I don't think my credentials align. Even when people call me a social worker, I'm not saying I don't do social work, but I'm an educator, if you know what I mean. And so oftentimes folks are referring to me as a social worker, but really I educate social workers. I know a lot about social work, but I practice social work in the realm of social work, but not as a professional social worker with credentials.
That's true.
And I don't think I agree with Shayla. I align with that, is that saying that I have an MSW or a PhD or whatever, it tells you almost nothing about me.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if we do have anyone in the audience, we would love for you guys to tell us who you are as well. And feel free to drop any questions in the chat as we go along, because we love when the audience participates and we can have dialogue with everybody. So yeah, I've been watching and reading Shayla's insights and wisdom on LinkedIn, on Substack lately, and it's just been really fun. And one thing I wanted to start with, because it really stuck out to me, and I think I actually shared this on my page too, is when you talked about 4 people: everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. That story that you told with, I just thought it was beautiful. I wonder if you could start there and just share it with anybody that's listening, and with us again.
Very interesting, because you caught me off guard with that. As I mentioned earlier on, that I was raised by my maternal grandparents. So my mom was still a part of my life, but from a visiting stance. So meaning I would visit her or she would visit. So when I visited her home, so she lived in the city and I lived in the village with my grandparents. So when I visited, it was a sign that they had on their wall. So it just caught my attention. So I understood the gist of the somebody, nobody, everybody, that ultimately what that story taught is that when we do not take the initiative to do something, we assume that somebody is doing it. And then in the end, it just happens that nobody does it. So we end up blaming somebody for doing what anybody could have done. So it just always stuck with me as a child, as I got to understand that. And then because I grew up in a village, I grew up in a village where everybody participated in almost everything. So when I say that, the example that I can give is that my grandparents, because we lived in a compound, a big compound, we had people that helped us. So sometimes there would be two men and 2 women, and they will just help in the distribution of chores. So if someone is in the field, someone is cooking. If someone is looking after the livestock somewhere, maybe the cows are lost today, somebody else is going to fetch the wood or something. But everybody participated. So if you came and found us in the field, you wouldn't know who is helping and who's part of the family by blood. So my grandparents raised us that way, that we all participated, regardless of whether you're the person who's visiting from the city or you're like me who grew up and lived in that village. We all knew what our responsibilities were. So we knew the value of carrying your water with your own head instead of just eating, right? Because I feel like kids here in the West, as much as they are given the opportunities to work as soon as they are 16, I didn't work until I was done high school in terms of what we consider employment. But I was trained in being part of a community where everybody participates. So you find that as much as I didn't have like what you would call regular employment, when I was done school, it wasn't hard to adjust into the employment part of the world, because I was used to participating as part of a household. You knew that you had work to do, whether you're cleaning the house or you're in the fields today. The only day that we didn't work was Sunday. And obviously during school days, Monday to Friday, we didn't go to the fields. But on Saturday, everybody worked, and it was not negotiable. My grandmother would come to your room at 4 a.m. and she would take the blanket with her, because she knew that if she didn't do that, we would probably take an hour trying to warm ourselves and what have you. I'm pretty sure someone here would call it abuse. But it was really part of our everyday responsibilities, that we knew that we walk. And what she wanted was, by the time it was hot, it was too hot to be working outside. We would be now coming home because we've been working from 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. or whatever the time was. So that story, if I have to circle back to that story, I think for me, it's a reminder of even that African proverb that I feel like has been appropriated, because you see people saying it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to raise a child, but rarely do we stop to even question, what does a village mean and what does it entail? Who's part of the village? And I think oftentimes we see that village as part of other people being the villagers, not realizing that we are also part of that village and we all have that responsibility. So when we talk about society that raises children as a village, that village constitutes parents, teachers, and every person in the community. Because as a child who was raised in the village, if I misbehaved in the community, and believe me, we didn't have any phones or social media, but by the time that I got home, my grandmother would know exactly what I was up to. And I would be held responsible from the community by whoever saw me, and they would actually make it clear to you. There would be no secrecy about it, and you would know exactly who told your grandmother what. So when I think about that story, for me, that is a reminder that we live in a society where we have to be that change that we wish to see, or we have to be participating in how we want the world to be, whatever that is, if that makes any sense.
Oh, yeah, total sense. And I imagine how was it when you left home and went to Canada? Was it a huge difference seeing that the way the village and the community connection responsibility was playing out?
Absolutely, because in the village, you were taught that everybody matters, everybody's important, and there were no titles. So as soon as I left our home, you interact with each person that you're going to meet on the road. We were supposed to, we greet by saying Sabona. Sabona means I see you. And when you say Sabona, it was really more than a greeting. It wasn't just hi. It was more so, I acknowledge your presence. I see you. I acknowledge even the presence of your ancestors who walk alongside you. So you really stopped to see people. So, and then I came here, you're at a bus stop and you say hi to people. They look at you like, mind your business. They look at you like you're asking for change or something. So it was even in the subtle and simple things like just a greeting, because in the village, I didn't need to know you or what family you were from, for me to just acknowledge your presence and say hi. If I met 100 people on a day, it means I would talk to 100. It was just a simple greeting to say, hello, how are you? And give the example of me. I started school because my grandparents were teachers. They were elementary school teachers who taught in the same village that I lived in. I started grade 1 when I was 4. And she says that I complained that I was too tired of the repetitive nature of preschool and what have you. So I think when she took me to preschool, when she took me to grade 1, she expected that it was going to be challenging. I think it was more so to discourage me that, you see, it's not as easy as you think it is, but it turned out to be the other way around. So I ended up really formally starting grade 1 when I was 4. But because we walked everywhere, the grade 7 students and the grade 6 students used to carry me on their neck until my feet were strong enough to walk on my own. So that was just them practicing the community centeredness of collective well-being, because that's how they were taught, that we walk alongside each other, but we also don't leave anyone behind. So you come from that to sometimes you don't even know who your neighbor is. And yet in the village, if you ran out of cooking oil, or you ran out of cornmeal, or whatever it is that you use for cooking your food, the store was far enough that you went to your neighbors before you thought about going to the store. And there was no shame in you asking for cooking oil, because the following day your neighbor could come asking for something else. And that mutual aid, that interdependence part was just the way that in which we existed, in which I feel like it was a law that was written in our hearts, more than no one set you down to say this is how it was. It's just the way it was. It was the way of life. So then you come to Canada here, and even the way we respected elders. And so when you saw an elder in the community, you knew that you couldn't speak to them in a certain way. And if they say, Shayla, come and go and get that, you wouldn't even question that. But then you come here, it's a whole different story, from the way the students interact with their teachers to just the day-to-day aspect of things. So it was such a culture shock, to be honest. Thinking of identity too. I went from being Sima, from Zimbabwe, from the Ndebele people, to being Black, a person of color, a visible minority. It was just a whole lot of new terms that I had never heard of before. And all of a sudden, I felt like they were imposed on me without my consent. And none of them actually said who I was. They actually said who I was not. So all those changes all at once. And I feel like we don't talk much about what it takes to go from being a majority to being minoritized. Because in Zimbabwe, everybody looked like me. Yes, we did have people from other cultures, ethnicities, and so forth, but I was the majority, and everybody looked like me. So then I came to Canada, and it was a different story. And I felt like nothing could have prepared me for that, although my mom had been here for 3 years prior to us. So it was a whole new world, even from learning the things like trunk, how you here call it your car, the trunk, and we call it boot, because in Zimbabwe is British colonized. So most of the terms are British. So it's a new world altogether. Even when you go to the store, there are some things that you would use. You guys call it ketchup. In Zimbabwe, we call it tomato sauce. So things like that, right? So I think that we need to be circling more on what it means pre-immigration and post-immigration experiences, because the whole integration, assimilation, conformity, and all of that, as soon as you see someone assimilating, it's a testimony of loss. There's something that you're losing in the process, because assimilation is usually a one-sided process. It's not, we talk about the melting pot, right? The melting into the dominant society pretty much means you're giving up your side of who you are. It's rarely ever an integrative process where you're maintaining who you are while assimilating into the new culture. So I feel like now I'm going into circles, but all of that I feel like there was a lot to learn. And I think when you're in a new culture, a new society, there is a part of the conformity and assimilation pieces happen as part of survival, and they happen unconsciously. You don't realize that you are losing a sense of who you are in the process of assimilation. So you start really now, the Shayla from Zimbabwe and Ndebele is suddenly the black Shayla because that's what everybody calls you. And then in the end, think after all of that, because I needed to pass my social work degree and all the books called me that. And so at first I was questioning, and then I realized the professors couldn't answer my questions. So in the end, you fall into place. You say what you're expected to say, but eventually, lucky enough, I would call it a privilege. If you're lucky enough to live in a society where you're done school, you have the opportunity of then taking a pause and saying, who am I? And I think I'm on that journey now where there's a part of reclamation and remembering who I was before I came here, because it was lost in the process of assimilating, even without me realizing that it was happening. And I think that's what brings us to the topic of Ubuntu, because when I came here, all I heard was, I am because you are. And it sounded nice on the tongue that I think I adopted it too. And then only to realize later and asking myself, what do I mean when I say I am because you are, when I live in a society that has many hierarchies and we have people that are unhoused. And mind you, in Zimbabwe, I had never in the village. So to be specific, in the village, there are no unhoused people. You never find somebody on the streets asking for anything. If you ran out of food, you go and knock on someone's home. There's no need for you to go into the streets because you'll be treated with dignity when you are in need, right? So you go from that to being here, and it's a whole different world altogether. And I feel like I've said a lot of things.
I think a lot of what you said is fascinating, and I think it's a huge critique on this modern Western, if you want to call it Western society, and the way that we live. Just imagine knocking on somebody's door to say that, I'm hungry, can you help me out? Well, we have a lot of food, but we would, even though we don't believe that, it would still, because we've been raised in this world, it would feel weird, if that makes sense. Even though I would totally believe in helping that person out, it still would feel weird to me.
Right.
There's a lot of things I wanted to ask you about, but Kimberly, we'll get to your question in a minute. I just wanted to say good morning to you. Thanks for being here. I'll ask your question in a minute. But you had me thinking about, I was reading about one of my ancestors, and it was during the times when cars were starting to show up. And he said, he had it in his journal, he had said he didn't like the cars because before then he would know and be able to talk to every single person that came by. And so he knew everyone. And now the cars just cruise by. And now, we move to 2025, and how many cars go by that you have no idea who's passing by your house or who's passing you by. So I just wanted to reflect that, but I wanted to take it to my education. I'm a professor, a social work professor. And when I first started, I really struggled with how to figure out how to get students where I wanted them to be connected and being able to even to answer that question, who am I? A lot of students haven't thought about that or haven't been asked that in class. But even thinking about the village and how things have changed over time, I kind of view the way I operate a class as a village, in the sense of, how can I effectively teach, especially social work? It's one thing if you were teaching biology or something, but I still think it would be relevant. But especially in social work, how can I effectively teach or learn with this group of students if I don't know them? If I don't know them, if I only know what they're there for, how can I just pass on some skills to them and they're just going to take it? I don't believe in that. And I think the way that I've tried to teach is to try to make it to epitomize the way that you've been talking about things, is in, that the only way for us to effectively go through a social work class or a social work program is for us to really get to know each other and to become a village, if that makes sense, together, so that we're looking out for each other. There's spaces for us to support each other, because, you know, you go through a college degree, it's a long process, 4 years plus. You go through a lot of ups and downs, a lot of struggles. And if you're just carrying around a burden all the time, how can we expect you to learn, if that makes sense?
Yep.
And so I believe in education to be something more relational. And even I taught a substance abuse class this past summer. Kimberly and maybe some others in the audience are from that class. And the conclusion that we came to is that addiction actually has very little to do with just overusing a substance. It has to do with your level of connection to your community, to yourself, to everyone else. And so I guess my overarching question to you is, in this modern day world where, like you said, we may not know our neighbor, but we have other ways of connecting. Like right now, we're connecting across continents with you, oceans. My students are from all over the globe. What's the importance of us going back to that idea of a village, even when it may not always encompass a physical space, but, you know, in the spirit of holding a class together, or holding space, or going through a journey together?
Right. You first of all, at the moment you talked about cars, it reminded me of the village, because my grandfather, since they happened to be teachers, we had a car. But our vehicle was not ours. It was the community car. It was the car that people came to when they had to be transported to the hospital, when somebody was sick, when there were conferences for church and what have you. It was that community car. They even nicknamed it Malaicha, which means that car that carries just about everything. So I think it's that integration process. We have a tendency of looking at the world through the binary, that it's either this or that. But if we want a society that realizes that there is no self-care without community care, then we need to be looking at it from an integrative lenses versus it's either this or that. Because every time we look at it through the this and that, we miss a lot, because there are some aspects of modernity that can be coupled with some things that are ancient. Like I talk about the spirit of Ubuntu, but we know that realistically we can't go back. There are aspects of the ancient world that we can't return to. We can't live in the bush now because our ancestors did and wore animal skin clothing and what have you. So I think it's a question of balancing. It's a question of balance. Like I gave the example that if my grandparents got their car, but it was just our car, then we are not really benefiting the community in a way. But the fact that the community was actually happy that we have a car now, because before the people that had vehicles, they had to walk very, very long distance to even go to the main road where you can catch a ride to take you to the hospital. Now there's a car in the community that can take you there. It's a question of knowing which days does he go here that we can catch that ride. And it's also knowing that our home was open 24/7, because when people get sick, they are not on schedule. It can be in the middle of the night where someone comes in and say, my wife is giving birth, and my grandfather knew that he needed to wake up in the morning and go. And sometimes it was people who didn't even have the money to give you for gas. But because they coexisted as a community, it was never me, myself, and I, but it was always us together. So when you ask, how do we try to reclaim the village when we live in an individualistic and capitalist society, I really think it boils down to each and every one of us realizing that none of us are actually self-made and can live as islands, looking back from the basics that even our existence, you being here, you are here because two people came together, right? And for us to exist and to thrive, we are wired for community, even though we can convince ourselves that, oh, I'm better off in solitude and what have you. We know that long-term solitude just becomes isolation and loneliness, right? So it's really just remembering that we are meant to exist as a community. And what does that look like in the concepts of where you are, and the concepts I teach too, but I teach only 2 courses, Afrocentric social work and the placement class, because I really just didn't want to teach for the sake of teaching. Because I think we've been in classes where you go in there. I spent 5 years in social work for my undergrad and my master's, and never in those classes was there a mention of enslavement of people of African descent in Canada, even though they were for 200 years. So when I'm teaching Afrocentric social work, I am putting those stories at the forefront, right? So it's really it boils down to the how part, not just the what. Is how do we do what we're doing? Because I find that sometimes we mean well, but we find ourselves, even the people that call themselves anti-oppressive, anti-this, anti-racist, but we use the same tools that were used to oppress, even when we think we are, when we mean well. Maybe let me put it that way. So I think it's a question of beyond the intent, what's the impact of what we're doing and how are we doing it? So it's good that you say to your students, how do you teach your students when you don't know who they are? But I think you are able to do that because it begins with who you got to know yourselves first. We are not able to give what we don't have. So if you haven't taken the time to reflect on who you are as an individual, what is your culture, who are you, you're very unlikely that you would ask those questions with your students and be interested in knowing who they are beyond what they do, beyond what they bring to the class. So it really begins with us doing our part as well. Hopefully I answered your question.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to repeat what you said. How can I know my students if I don't know myself? Or how can I even have the desire or the curiosity if I have never had it about myself?
Right.
And that's the same with, we talk about clinical social work. How can I help my clients without knowing myself? And this is why it's such a huge part of revolutionary social work, is that personal inner work, looking inwards and knowing ourselves so that we can do this outer work that is very challenging, but we cannot do that until we look inward. Yeah, there's so much that you talked about that I think aligns so closely with the values of revolutionary social work, which we can get into a little bit more. But I do want to go to the chat. Who do we have?
Let's take Kimberly first.
Yeah.
I'll read this one. Kimberly she says, I love the wisdom of your grandmother taking the blanket. I was also raised in a multi-generational family where participating was a part of our way of life. Were you able to carry your grandparents' wisdom and ways forward to your own children in a different cultural environment?
That's a great question. I wish I could say yes, but unfortunately that world that my grandparents raised me in, I no longer have access to it, right? We do not have a farm that we're going to we live in a society. I'm in Canada and I happen to have 3 children whom I wish that I would have somehow planted the same seeds that my grandmother planted. But in the grander scheme of things, I'm trying to survive. Sometimes there were times when I had 3 jobs and what have you. So you find yourself really just invested in survival and just making sure that if someone gets to school on time and what have you. And there's not so much, I don't have that village that allows me to be able to benefit from the village in the way that I did. The only reason my grandmother was able to impart the knowledge that she did is because we existed in a village that allowed that. If she wasn't the one teaching me, there was somebody else, whether it's the aunt or whoever is at home, because it wasn't just us. But here, I don't have that support system. So for the most part, you're really trying to get things done. You're on survival mode instead of thriving, because the village system allowed us to exist as a community in a way that allowed that knowledge passing, the oral traditions, the stories to be told. And unfortunately, I don't have that. I do the best that I can, but I acknowledge that I didn't, or I haven't. I tried to, the remnants of it, perhaps the few stories that they have had, but not in the way that I benefited from being raised in a village.
Yeah. We empathize with that too, because we are away from both of our families and we don't have that village created here yet. Hopefully that will come, but it's hard, and you sometimes are in survival mode where we both have to work full time, and there's so much more that we would love to give our children in terms of like presence, but we do our best when we are present. We try and be as present as possible, and I think that's kind of the balance that you were talking about before. It's never perfect and it's never equal, but when we really place intention, and be authentic in the way that we're trying to live those values that are super important to us, while we're trying to also survive in this world society that we're in, as
Right.
much as possible we have to find some sort of balance.
Yeah, the great example, my first child started daycare when she was 5 months old. Our second started daycare when she was literally 3 weeks old. I was in school full time, and unfortunately there was no part of me that even considered the fact that I could take a break from school, because while I was in school, part of my financial stability depended on the student loans that I had. So me being off school and having to look after my child could have meant that I needed to be on child welfare or something. But at the time that I was in school, I was literally living on student loans. So I didn't have that choice of, I can leave my child at my grandmother's or at my aunt's. The way that I grew up that way, I had never been to a daycare because that's not how we existed. When we say village, that village meant the child is literally raised by everybody who's trusted by the family. So unfortunately, my children, I took our youngest with me in 2023 to visit and back to the village where I was raised, because my grandparents, I'm very fortunate that they are still alive in their 90s and 80s. They're still there. But my child did not connect with it in the way that I did, because for me it's home. That's where I had not known any other home until I was 20 something, or until I went to college and stuff. So for her, she just didn't connect with it. Even when I went back to say goodbye to my grandparents, she asked to stay in the city with my cousins, because it just didn't feel, she didn't connect with it in a way that I did. And there was, as I say that, and as I noticed that, there was a part of me that grieved that, because had I had the resources to visit as often as I needed to, it would have become part of home for her early on. But taking her at age 10, when she's never been there before, it became a culture shock for her.
Yeah, because raised in a world where, in the city or with technology, with the disconnection that we're living in now, it is a culture shock. And I do want to get into that more, but let's go to Michelle. Let's see, Michelle says, knowledge is input, wisdom is output. I love the inherent mental pause that must happen for each one of us, personally and internally. We need to pause and recognize the need to pause and reflect on our responses, but more importantly, our reactions. And then Michelle asks, I'm curious, how do you approach those who don't know who they are? How do you help them realign?
That's a great question. And I want to answer it by sharing a story that in one of my social work classes, one of the students used the word people of culture to talk about, I guess, those that we can dub marginalized people with marginalized identities. I had explicitly shared my dislike for the word people of color. So in her mind, she was trying to replace the people of color with people of culture. And so I listened to her for a while. I didn't want to interrupt, but I also didn't want to be lost in her presentation. So I interrupted and I said, excuse me, do you mind just telling us a little bit what you mean when you say people of culture, so that everyone, at least who's listening to your presentation, can follow? And she froze, and I just could see, eventually we were able to see that what she meant was what I say, the replacement of people of color. So it occurred to me that she did not consider herself as a person that has culture. If she is comfortable to say people of culture, which means that she thinks that they are people who do not have culture. And I think that's what I've realized with what I call our melanin lin people of European ancestry that have been taught that they are white. Most of them, because I don't want to put it in a blanket statement, because there's always people who are doing their work. But I think there's an understanding that they don't have a culture. But everyone has culture. It's a question of whether we are connected to it or not, right? So what do I do when I work, when I interact with people who do not know who they are? I start with really just acknowledging, right? Meeting people where they are, acknowledging that fact that there are many factors that contribute to many people being displaced, many people being disconnected from who they are, and that we can still be curious enough to research from the remnants that's left, whether you have a grandmother or an uncle or something, that there's always that first step that we can take, and there's always seeds that we can plant and grow. Sometimes it can look like just a family recipe. It's going to look different from one place to another. But I think it's important to realize that we are in a culturally and linguistically diverse world. And when we take the time to be curious about what that it means for you, for your family tree, and I'm saying that with realization that some people are adopted and what have you, and they may not even have a connection of anything, because some adoptions are closed and people don't get to know who they were before that adoption. So sometimes it's really just understanding that our stories are fragmented, but we are not broken as a people, that we can somehow piece the pieces of our stories together somehow with whatever knowledge that we have. Sometimes that's all we can do. I specifically use Tree of Life. I really love Tree of Life as that methodology that explores so much that the mainstream modalities haven't done for me, because it starts with, uses the tree metaphor to look at different aspects of your life without pathologizing you, without turning you into a medical term, but starting with the roots. The roots look at your story as a child. Who are you? Who are your people? What lessons and knowledge were passed on to you when you were a child, and all of that. So I have found it to be an intercultural and transcultural tool that I use a lot, because I've used it with Indigenous people. I've used it with people of European ancestry, people of African descent, Asian people, and just about everybody, because we all have stories, we all have roots, we all have a culture somehow. And even sometimes, even just naming the fact that I'm disconnected from who I am is the beginning of that journey of curiosity, because sometimes we are not given those opportunities to stop and reflect and even ask who I am. And sometimes it just begins with asking people, what does your name mean? Who named you? What are the stories behind your name? Because even our names on its own, sometimes they tell a colonial story. My grandparents have English names, and that's a testimony that they were born under the Smith rule during the time that Zimbabwe was under British colony. So obviously their grandparents were trying to survive the colonial era. But when they had their 6 children, everybody has a Ndebele name. And to the extent that they gave me their grandchild a Ndebele name, right? So it's really all those stories. And sometimes it's a question of just asking someone, do you speak another language other than English? And because people do a lot to that assimilation process that I talked about. And sometimes you're changing your accent because you're so tired of people saying, pardon me, what did you say? And you just have to survive that. So there's many ways to approach who we are as people, whether it's through names or language, or even learning the story of immigration, that your family have been living in this country for so much. How did they get here? what is our relationship with the land in which we reside. I think there's really just too many ways of approaching that topic. And if you had asked me this question a while ago, I would have used the term killing two birds with one stone, until I met somebody who said feeding many birds with one hand. And I just thought that was a beautiful shift, because our language has a lot of violence embedded in it that we sometimes don't even question that. So how did I get to the feeding many birds with one hand? I was talking about the tree of life, right? Even when people are exploring their stories, there's so much healing that happens there, but not from a clinical mainstream perspective that we treat people as we are treating. Even the word treatment, right? It implies that something is being fixed, but there's something beautiful about stories being shared. Who are you? Who are your people? The leaves of Tree of Life represents the most significant people in your life. So even beginning to name that, if you find yourself struggling and you can't even name anybody, that alone is a revelation of something that needs to be explored. And how are you receiving that? How is your nervous system when you're realizing that I literally have nobody? Do you have nobody because you've secluded yourself, but yet the village is there, or the village has shunned you, right? Because there's many ways that we can look at a story.
I really appreciate you bringing up not pathologizing people's just human experience. And I try and do that all the time in my work. And that's where I think you've seen the circle of self, the framework that I live by, but also share with anybody I'm working with, because it isn't about pathologizing the challenges that are going on or the experience that you've had. It's about looking at different elements in different areas of your life and asking questions, like you say, and getting to know yourself more. I laughed when you said about accents, because I find myself doing that a lot. I'm from the UK, and so specifically asking for a bottle of water is one of the hardest things, because everyone looks at me like, huh? And I'll be like, tell Ace, say what I need. And I'll sometimes, I think we've talked about in the past, like, see if I say it different, but then that's me changing myself again. But it does make me insecure sometimes. And I really have to ask myself, why am I so insecure about that?
Right.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Culture is so important, and we come from different cultures. I mean, you're from here in the States, I'm from the UK, and I know my ancestry somewhat. I know my ancestry from Nigeria, my father's side, but immigrated to Jamaica, and then my grandparents from Jamaica were part of that Windrush generation that went to England, and so everyone was quite displaced. And my mother is from England, and it's really hard to find our ancestry past England and Jamaica, and even in Jamaica, the records is so difficult. But when I've talked to people, it is what you're saying. It's just asking questions and knowing myself and the land, and looking at stories and things like that. Whereas Ace has, your ancestry is a lot easier to find, and it's beautiful learning about your family and the culture that comes from. And then we can create our own culture in a sense from what we know. Right.
I just wanted to add one thing before we turn it back to you, is that from my experience, my own reflection of my own journey, and then working with students all the time, is that many of us think that culture is just something that you inherit, that it's only something that's inherited, that it's given to you. Whereas it's also something that you can create, you can actively create, because right, culture is created by people living, and thus the culture becomes of that. And so you have the autonomy today, and the power and the freedom, the ability to develop. You can't change everything, and you do inherit culture, but you also can play a role in creating it actively for yourself, for your family, for your children, etc.
Right. And what you said in Tree of Life, I always say to people, the tree it's a living tree, and it can be uprooted, right? The tree can be replanted. And you just reminded me of Dr. Wade Noble's quote. He said, and I believe he's an African, he specializes in African-centered psychology, and and Africana studies. He said, culture is to people as water is to fish. And I've just found that so enlightening and insightful, because it speaks so much about the impact that culture has on human behavior. Because some of the things that we even call culture are the things that we inherited as trauma and that we've somehow normalized and we call culture, right? So it's such a beautiful way of just, and I think that alone for me is a reminder that everybody does have culture. And like you said, we can reauthor our stories, we can read story, we can write new books all together. And it's a question of realizing that. Who are you co-authoring your story with? Because life is a co-creation process. We are never just solitarily creating something. Even unbeknownst to us, it's really just a co-creation. I have the two of you here retelling stories about social work and sharing that his history was easier to find, and you're like, there's some remnant and some pieces in my story, but and the other thing that I think is important is that your body tells you when you feel, whether you feel at home or not, when you are in a place. There are some places that you just go and something feels familiar and you may not be able to put your fingers to it, but you just feel a sense of home. And sometimes that's enough.
Yes, that is so true. And I think as soon as you said that, whenever the sun is shining on me and I feel the warmth on the skin, just this morning I was outside and in my yoga practice, and the warmth of the sun on my skin does feel like home.
Right.
It's very comforting, and yeah. Thank you for that. We do have another question in the chat. This is Michelle.
Yeah, and I think Michelle's question ties right into this, because we were just talking about, whereas I can go on, most of my family went through the state of Utah at some point, and so they're tied to, although we don't have any affiliations really today, we're all tied to the LDS, the Mormons, back in the days. And they did one thing that they do a really good job at is taking genealogical records and collecting those things. And so for me, I can go online and I can find stories, anecdotes, journals, all kinds of things that have helped, fill the hole that was inside of me things I didn't know. Whereas Alicia's got to look a little deeper in a different way. And I think we both have to still do that looking inward and reflection. And so just in a precursor to what Michelle's question coming up is I think that one of the ways that you can do that is you have to listen to yourself inside that inner voice, that heart wisdom, intuition. There's a lot of different ways that people describe it, but it can be hard to wrap our head around it at first. But if we listen, then sometimes those answers will manifest themselves just by looking inward. You want to read Michelle's question?
Yeah. So Michelle says, for myself, that knowledge of my own Western white culture compared to Indigenous feels empty, that I don't have a culture except that which is demonstrated by a society that doesn't know who they are either. So how do we find that ability to connect to something that we have never known? Separation, isolation, and stigmatization are encouraged from both sides. So how do we explore or help others to identify and connect with no cultural foundation?
Right. Yeah, you know what? That's a great question that I may not be qualified to answer to some degree, because I do realize my privilege. I happen to have that privilege of being raised and being born and raised in the lands where my ancestors are from. So when I talk about reclaiming and going back to something, it's because there's something to go back to that I have known. So it becomes a very complicated process when that has been disrupted to the point that there's no records of your history and what have you. But I think that every time nobody is ever a passive recipient of an experience. We are always trying to survive. So you will find that in the survival story of your ancestors, there's always something that's left that gets passed on. Whether it's, I don't know, it could be some pieces of the language or some stories or whatever. But in cases where there's no trace, I find myself struggling with how to answer that, because if it's not there, it's not there. You can only work with what you have. We can be as curious as what's available to us. If you don't have grandparents, great grandparents, I think it becomes really hard to say, this is what I'm tracing, this is where it's at, if there's none. And I think it goes back to what Ace said about creating our our own cultural ethos and our own stories. And I think the part that can be hard is when we are in a society of division, where we are often talking about cultural appropriation and what have you, instead of just focusing on appreciation. Because I think at the end of the day, there are some things that are hard to say, this one was started by who. It just pushes us further to division. I've seen the Beyonce story about her hair being blown and some allegations about what that means. Yet there are people of African descent who also have hair that are blown. They may not be majority, but we do have some. So it's really tough to, when you're working with fragmented information or information that has been distorted. And I think that from a colonial perspective, we know that a colonial agenda was that of destruction and distortion, because it's hard to control something that is very plural and that has multiplicity. But when you homogenize things and you flatten them, it's easy to control. So perhaps the stories of why the disruption happened to begin with and the disconnection and displacement are also part of that story of understanding history as well, in terms of who were we before the migration happened or the displacement and what have you. We may not have definitive answers, but part of exploring those stories on its own, the multi-stories, the multi-layers of stories, is just part of that process of understanding that I may not know this, but it doesn't mean that I am broken as a person. It doesn't mean that I am cultureless. It just means that I'm disconnected from my culture, but I do have a culture that I may not be aware of. So going forward, I am creating my own stories and my own culture and passing some. You start your own traditions with your family, if you happen to have your own family that you've started. We can, because when we look at even culture is dynamic too. There are very few things that have stayed the same. Things changed with time and seasons and what have you. So I think it's looking at culture not as a linear thing, but more so as a nuanced concept that we can recreate and co-create.
Yeah. And it goes back to going inwards too, when there's not so much external information.
Right.
A lot of my focus right now has been on how we can quiet the noise of the world right now and go inwards, because there's so much that's pulling us out. The distraction and the devices, let alone, I was talking to someone the other day about the social media, but especially like the short form content, the TikTok, the shorts, the reels, and how much that's just constant dopamine hits every time you scroll, but also it's just distracting, pulls your mind this way, then that way, then this way, then that way. And even when you turn it off, your mind is so scrambled. It's so hard to shut that noise off. And so what can we do to reduce that? And we do have control over that. It's hard because we're like so consumed by all of it. It's everywhere. But we do have control of how much we consume in that way, and how much time we spend in stillness as well. And so I wonder if we could just touch before we finish on technology and AI as well, because I've seen you talk a little bit on AI and how using it and not using it, and how other people, the judgment of other people of using it, and where is it safe, where is it taking away from authenticity. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit of what's been coming up for you.
Right. And then I think part of cultural humility is that awareness of things within our scope of practice and things where we don't have expertise. So I want to put a disclaimer that I'm not an expert on AI use and technology use, but I do remember my professor's name was called Robert Levine, and he said technology bastardizes social skills. And to be honest, I didn't quite get what he meant then. But I feel like I'm in full circle now where I realize that we have a lot of keyboard warriors who barely have communication and social skills, and people who don't think before they respond. It's always reactions and people barking at each other instead of dialoguing and debating and what have you. So I think it goes back to what I said earlier on about balance, right? It's, if technology is used with transparency and integrity, I think it can really enhance whatever we already have. If it's used ethically, I don't see, we go back to Stonewall where we used to we didn't even have phones. Letters had to be written. That is when we moved to a point where people could write, right? We go back to the ancient times when when we didn't even know how to write. But we live in a world where things are changing. And as things change, we also adjust to the changes. So I struggle with the accusations of theft when people say, oh, AI is just theft and it harms the environment. And I, without going into the whataboutism and what have you, but I just struggle because I think we can agree that technology on its own, everything somewhat harms the environment. It's not like we are living on land and on trees and hunting and cooking by fire. We have electricity now. We have stoves and fridges that uses electricity and stuff. So I struggle with selective, what word should I use? With selective morality, when people can pick and choose the causes that they want to police and what they think is acceptable to them. If I just plagiarize your work and I reproduce it as my own, I think that's a simple black and white situation that's unethical. But if I go onto ChatGPT and I say, hey, create 2 black women for me, and this is the concept that I'm saying, I honestly don't see any big harm with that. Does it plagiarize other people's work? I believe that it's argued that these AI tools, sometimes there's an issue of other people's work being plagiarized and what have you.
Yeah.
I think we can pick and choose what works for us, but ultimately I find myself, because it's just in the last, I happened to had a post that I think in the use of modern language, we could say that it went viral in a way, because I think it's got like 50,000 views and whatever. And I find it interesting that it's the one that I found people being judgmental on the AI use, but anything else that wasn't trending, nobody was questioning anything. It was all my words verbatim. I did not steal anybody's words, but because I used AI to create the graphics, I found people saying things like, you can't claim to be decolonizing if you are using AI. And I think that in that case, then we should all be living on the land, because even the aeroplanes, they harm the environment. But if I didn't have them, I wouldn't be visiting my grandparents. I wouldn't be even in Canada right now. So I struggle with when things are looked at from an extreme and absolute lenses. I think it's a question of us balancing integrity and transparency and ethics. There are some people who actually specialize in, I believe, ethical use of AI and what have you, and I think everything has its own limits. But I would be curious to hear what your thoughts are, because I find myself in that middle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you
I
for
hope I
sharing that.
answered your question, because it's just
No,
one
you
of those
did.
raw new experiences that I'm still trying to figure out. But I'm committed to changing my mind if I found information that absolutely challenges and I see my core values being bruised and what have you. So I'm not really interested in just being right. But I'm at that point where I'm figuring it out.
And that's what's key, that it can be an evolution and you can be open to new information. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm no expert on the ethics behind the use of information and all of that. The concern that I have with AI as a social work professor is
Mhm.
it seems to be beginning to erode some people's ability to produce on their own.
Of course.
I agree with most of what you said. AI can be very useful in a lot of different ways, and helps me save me time from the labor of certain things that's just really laborious to go through and do it, that it does it just the exact same thing. So it seems very positive in that regard. But so I used to use for my online courses, I used to use blogs because I'd want them to be personal, self-application and reflection and storytelling.
Mhm.
While some of them still stayed good, many of those blogs turned into saying the exact same thing in the exact same words. It would start off, even AI has evolved in just the last couple of years, because at first it was stuff like, it would say like tapestries of wisdom and et cetera all the time. And now it's gotten away from that so much, but almost everything is written like, social work is not this, it's this. And it says the
Right.
exact same,
Things.
I don't know what you want to say, patterns of speech
Yeah.
or patterns of writing.
Yeah.
And I just worry that folks won't be able to do that for themselves, and I think what
Right.
you essentially want is, if you're talking about somebody writing a journal or reflection, is, for them to be thinking and going inward and writing it down. So if you're putting that into Chat GPT, there's something that gets lost along the way.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it goes back to the bastardization of social skills, right? If we can't critically think on our own and we are relying on it and depending on it, and as a professor as well, I want my students to be able to challenge things and think on their own without chat GPTing everything. But I also realize my limitations, that I probably wouldn't have a way of actually confirming that this is somebody's independent thoughts or not. So it's a reality that I have to live with.
Yeah. Yep. I'm at the point now where it is, if ChatGPT or technology is enhancing my
Mm-hmm.
skills and my creativity
Mm-hmm.
and all of that, then that can be beneficial. But it's when it stifles me and when I start to realize, oh wait, I could do that myself. I don't need
Right.
to ask ChatGPT that, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's where it's key for me. And we were talking to someone yesterday, and it just reminded me of, there's certain things, like you said, there's a lot of things that are harming the environment and
Yeah.
our minds and things like that. And social media, I have such a hard relationship with it because I just
Right.
think there's so much that's harming in social
Of
media, right?
course.
But if we can take some of that energy and transform it into something positive and put more positivity out there on social media and more
Right.
love and more learning and authenticity, then I don't think that's a bad thing. And that's where I'm at right now.
Right.
If we can
Me too.
transform it, knowing what energy we're putting out there and what energy is coming back to us too.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question I've been waiting to ask a little bit
Mm.
before we get out of here. And so one of the values of revolutionary social work is to recenter, indigenous African wisdom stories, things like that. And when you look at social work's a good example, I think, because social work is always talking about marginalized people and things like that. But then we reinforce the same thing. If we were to have a textbook most of the time on something, there would be a special little chapter or something on the side that talks about, an African-centered thought, Afrocentered thought or idea or something like that. And so they don't center it. They're saying, they're complaining about marginalization while they're doing the exact same thing in the way that we are attempting to be inclusive, but we're including it by literally putting it on the margins sometimes. And so I just wondered, I'd love to learn more about what you do in your Afrocentric social work course and how.
That's the actually main text.
Wow.
And it's a text that actually centers, not decenters. It just puts that African centered knowledge at the forefront. And that's the main textbook of my class. And all the readings beyond the ones in this book, I can say it's actually the reason I said yes to teaching that course, because it's not done as a performative allyship or a tokenistic way of, oh, we just have this course. It's actually a course that really centers the African centered ways of knowing and being and coexisting. They did the research, and of course I tweaked the course somehow, the course outline, so that it felt relatable to me. But I always start it with, are you too familiar with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story? I start today with my students so that I am planting the seeds and setting the tone of what the class is going to focus on, because I love that danger of a single story. Was part of my mandatory videos when I was in my undergrad 19 years ago. I feel so ancient now. And there was something about it, that just that idea of the danger of a single story. In this case, the single story is that dominant story, is the Eurocentric story, that social work is not only founded on. The foundations of social work are really on that single story. So when we bring in indigenous knowledge systems to the forefront, we are doing that reclamation and recentering that you talked about. And when we look at colonialism and just how it manifests, usually the researchers or the scholars of decoloniality have put it under the coloniality of being, coloniality of knowledge, and coloniality of power. And I think when you look at those three tenets of how they interweave, you realize it goes back to what you said. The coloniality of being talks about how colonialism disrupts and distorts who we are and our sense of being. And then the power piece is just that Eurocentric hegemony, right? That we talk about whose knowledge are we learning, whose stories are being told, and by who. And again, it goes back to that. And then the power and knowledge piece, I think they go hand in hand, right? They've called it epistemicide and other ways of how you distort a people's language, a people's culture, so that because you're easy to control when you don't know who you are. I will come in today and call you a monkey, and you're going to start jumping like one because you don't know who you are. But when you know who you are, even when I come in with these theories and these labels and acronyms, it's very easier for you to resist that when you know who you are. And so when you talk about how do you do that, I think it's courses like this one. In Canada, there's 3 colleges, there's 3 universities. It's University of Calgary, the Trent University, and University of Dalhousie. And I can tell you that we have, I don't know how many schools of social work we have, but it's only those 3 that have adopted the Afrocentric social work course. So you can see that we have a long way to go, but I think we always start from somewhere. When you start from somewhere, then you can grow and nurture those seeds.
Yes. Thank you. And that's what revolutionary social work's been about. It started this tiny little seed that we've had, and it's growing organically, just like Afrocentric social work. And thank you for sharing that. And we'll make sure to put in the description and anything we send out, like links to that book. And I think you had a recent healing program too. Is that right, with the Tree of Life that you talked about?
Oh yeah. Well, no, there was just it was a co-creation process. It was a non-profit organization that just invited me to go and facilitate a 6-week program of just women that were looking at different areas of their lives. And I thought Tree of Life was the best way to do that, because it wasn't saying there's something wrong with them. It was more so of you separate the problem from the person. And what I love about Tree of Life is that what it does is, oftentimes from a Eurocentric lenses, when someone comes in, you're like, oh, what's the presenting problem? How long have you had these symptoms? And blah, blah. We just go straight into the problem. And what the Tree of Life co-developer taught me is that that's very harmful, because it's like finding someone drowning, and instead of pulling them out, you're busy talking to them, saying, how did you get there? Are you breathing? Do you know how to swim? So that visual for me just gave me, because I've noticed how triggering it can be for people when we go straight into their problems. But what Tree of Life does then is that you reconnect people with their islands of safety first before you explore their storms. So meaning, I gotta pull you out and give you a blanket and make sure you're warm and you've regained your strength before I can even figure out how did you fall in there, how did you get there, how long have you been there? Because once you reconnect with your roots and your ground and your leaves of your tree and the fruits of your tree and the trunk of your tree, you realize that, oh my goodness, I'm so resourced. I have all these things that I had forgotten about, because wounds and harm and adversities, they tend to disconnect us and distort from our core values and who we are. So our approaches really matter, because some actually can make things worse. If I'm struggling and you tell me through your CPT lenses that I have cognitive distortions, all that I'm hearing is that I'm the problem, that I need to think positively. But we know that you can't positive think your way out of trauma. You can't positive think your way out of an oppressive environment.
Exactly.
I feel like I'm preaching now.
I love it.
Preach away.
Yeah, please. You're making me question so many things that I may have fallen into, just autopilot within my work, especially working within a healthcare organization. I try so hard to stay grounded in my values, but as soon as you said that presenting problem, that triggered something in me, and I can see that little form on the laptop. So yeah, I'm definitely going to do some thinking and how I talk about this with the people I work with as well. But thank you so much, Shayla. Really appreciate everything you shared today. I knew this was going to be a great dialogue. And thank you everyone in that came to the audience, Kimberly, Michelle, who's still here. Did you have any last words, Ace?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, thank you for being you. You're a beautiful person. You're a beautiful social work. Your students have got to be just blessed and fortunate to have you, Just thank you for being you, and just keep going. And I hope that we can interact again. I just became familiar with you over the last week or so, and just everything I've seen that's popped up on social media and talking to you today, everything I've been like, whoa, this is wonderful. And so I just want to say thank you. And we need more people like you. I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. And most importantly, thank you for building a table and extending those invitations where these conversations can be had. So it was such an honor to be with you too, and center revolutionary social work. And I think the concept of revolutionary social work speak to that restoring and reclaiming and reauthoring, that just because a system is this does not necessarily mean that we need to stay loyal to it. So I really appreciate the time that we spent together. Thank you. In my language, we say ngiyabonga. That's how you say thank you in isiNdebele.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you. And we will hopefully continue to be in dialogue and connection, community, and conversations. Hopefully more to come. Well, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, Shayla, and we'll be in touch. Thank you, everybody.
Aloha.
Peace.
You've been listening to the Revolutionary Social Work Podcast, and we just want to say thank you for your continued support. You can catch us on YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify. Remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share our content with the world. But most of all, never forget to keep being revolutionary. Peace.